Hello and welcome back to the Kou Louise Academy YouTube channel. In our current setup, we have our domain controller 01, which is our primary domain controller, if we would like to call it that way. So we have this primary domain controller, and right now in our setup, we do have a client computer called client 01, and this client 01 computer has been joined to our domain. So in this example, I just want to illustrate something. So let's suppose that in our Active Directory database, as we are aware, our Active Directory server or our domain controller has a database that is the ntds.dit. So this is the name of the database of our Active Directory. So within this Active Directory, we have a user called John, and this user has a password 1234. So if this user comes to client 1 computer and tries to log in, if the user enter the username John and put in the password 1234 and press the enter key or press the OK or click on the OK button, before this user logs in, what happens is this login information, that is the username and the password, this information, it is sent from the client computer to our domain controller. So our domain controller will use a protocol called LDAP, Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. So what this protocol is used for, this protocol is used by the domain controller to query the Active Directory database to verify whether there is a user within the database called John. So once that username is verified, that there's a user called John, then the next information that is verified is the password. Does the user John has the password as 1234? And if both conditions are correct, then that user can be allowed to log in to this client computer. The process of querying the Active Directory database to make sure that this user called John exists within the Active Directory database and the password matches with the password that is on record for this user, that process is known as authentication. So it means that the user has been authenticated. Authentication is simply the process to verify that a person is who they say they are. So in this case, this user, John, with the password 1234 does exist within the database and all the information match. So the user can log in. Let's suppose that the user name John matches a user within our database, but let's say the password is incorrect or the password doesn't match. If the password doesn't match, then the user will have a message that your password is incorrect. So those things are happening behind the scene, all right? So LDAP is the protocol that is used to query the Active Directory database. Then we have another one called Kerberos. So Kerberos is used to do the authentication for the user, right? So authentication is done by Kerberos, and then the searching of the database is done by the LDAP protocol, okay? And then for systems that don't support Kerberos, we have another protocol called NTLM. So that protocol, it is used for applications that don't support Kerberos authentication. They will use the NTLM for authentication. So those are a few terms I want you to start getting used to. Then there is another term called authorization. So how does authorization come into place? Let's suppose that on this domain controller, let's suppose we have a file. All right, let's call it file 1. So we have a file called file 1. The file 1 is on this domain controller. So when the user is authenticated, the user logs in. Now, when the user tries to access the file, even though the user was authenticated and the user does exist on the Active Directory database and the user was able to log in. But let's suppose that John works in the IT department, right? So John works in the IT department, but then this file is actually a payroll file. So we know that John, as an IT user, shouldn't have access to a file that contains payroll information of all the employees within the organization. So even though John has been authenticated, when John double-clicks on this file to open the file, John will get an error message called access denied, right? Access denied means that John is not authorized to access that file. So we have another thing called authorization, right? So again, Kerberos does both authentication and authorization for Active Directory. Okay? So just because a user is authenticated doesn't mean they are necessarily authorized to access everything within the organization. So just because you work with the organization doesn't mean that you can just access any file or folders. So we will come to how we can configure these things to either allow someone to have access to a folder or some documents or to deny them, right? But I was just trying to explain to you that Kerberos is responsible for doing authentication and authorization of objects on our Active Directory network. And then LDAP is the protocol that Active Directory used to query the Active Directory database for information. Okay. In this case, DC01 is doing our authorization and authentication, allowing people to log in, allowing computers to join the domain, and all of those things. In a situation where for some reason we need to perform, let's say, routine maintenance on DC01. So maybe we need to install some Windows update that will require us to restart DC01, or let's say DC01 is running out of hard drive space and we order some additional hard drive and we need to shut down DC01, put in the hard drive, and then reboot DC01, right? So usually for this kind of maintenance and routine and tasks, you want to do it at a time when most people are not at work. So usually it's done in the night because people work usually in the morning to maybe 4 p.m. or 5 p.m. So you want to schedule those things either in the night, or let's say you work in a bank that people work 24/7, then maybe you want to do it over the weekend. But what if you don't want the shut down at all, right? So, or let's take worst case scenario. What if there is a power failure and DC01 crashes? If DC01 crashes, all of our users and all of our computers will not be able to access our Active Directory network because there is no DC01 to do authentication and authorization and all of those things that the Active Directory is responsible for handling. It is in this situation that to prevent this kind of disaster from happening is where you will set up a second domain controller. So in this episode, we will be setting up a second domain controller called DC02. So that when DC01 crashes, DC02 can handle all of our authentication and authorization. Or probably if DC01 doesn't crash, let's say we need to, like I said, shut down DC01 and perform some hardware upgrade or some routine maintenance, we can shut down DC01 any time of the day, any time of the night, any day of the week, because we have a second domain controller that will handle all of the authentication and authorization. So in this case, if you have this setup where you have DC01 and DC02, it means that your setup is redundant, right? So they're redundancy, right? So redundancy or redundant is just the fact that when one goes down, the other one takes over till that one can come back on. But you have like a backup, right? So it's just like it's just like you work with the bank. The bank has the bank is receiving electricity. The bank is receiving electricity from the government. So, but then apart from the electricity, or even if you don't have electricity, you are using a generator that is providing electricity for the bank. But then you have UPS, right? So we have UPS. All right, so these are UPS. UPS simply means uninterrupted power supply. So these UPS have batteries in them. So what happens is that the power line gets connected to the UPS, and then all the devices plug into the UPS, right? So all the devices plug into the UPS. So this is power. So the power, as it's passing through the UPS, going to all of the devices to power on your devices, the batteries in the UPS are getting charged, right? So when the power goes down, then all of these devices will stay on because they will start to function off the battery from the UPS. Or you can have, and let's say you have one generator, so generator 1, then you have generator 2 can be on standby. So as generator 1 is providing electricity, then you have an automatic failover. So if for some reason you need to, again, perform some kind of routine maintenance of generator 1, generator 2 takes over and provide power. So in that case, for power, you have a redundant power and supply. All right. So the same goes with the server as well. And it can be, this concept of redundancy can be applied to different devices. Even if you have a switch for that, all your devices are plugged to the switch, you want to have a second switch for backup. In case this switch goes down, the second switch takes over and all the devices are still connected to the network and have network access because there is a second switch. So in this episode, we will set up a second domain controller, and then we will have a redundant environment so that when one domain controller is off, the other domain controller is on and doing our authentication and authorization. So in this episode, that's what we're going to look at. So this is just a basic explanation of why we are setting up a second domain controller, so that when we set up a second domain controller, you know exactly why. And these concepts that we are talking about, these are real life concepts, right? So if you work with an organization that you just have one domain controller, you know that you should be recommending to your supervisor or to your IT manager that we need to have a second domain controller for just in case our first domain controller, if it crashes, then our second domain controller can handle our authentication and authorization. Okay? So that's a practical thing that you can just take this concept and carry into the real world. So stay tuned and watch the rest of this video. You will see how we will set up our second domain controller. Okay? So let's go to the practical aspect of all of this demonstration. All right. So after the explanation, we are going to set up our second domain controller. So that will serve as a redundant domain controller. So in case the first domain controller goes down, then we have another domain controller that takes care of authorization and authentication and all of those nice things that domain controller handles, right? So what I've done here is when you come to the server manager dashboard and you click on local server, I have renamed my computer to DC02 since this will be our second domain controller. I've given it a static IP address of 192.168.100.2, and also I have changed the time zone on this new domain controller. So, and then that's important, but then I will just come to the network and just show you something. So if I come to the network, and when you look at the details, I've given an IP, like I said, I've given the default subnet mask, and I have put in the DNS. The DNS is very important because without DNS, you wouldn't be able to join to the Active Directory domain. So I've put in, this is the IP address of DC01, since that's our DNS server and our Active Directory server at the same time. I have put in that IP address. So make sure that your network settings on the new computer that is going to be the second domain controller, make sure that it is set within the same subnet as your DC01. So I will close this place, and also I've gone ahead to manage, and I've added roles and features, and I've added the Active Directory Domain Services role to this server. So if you don't know how to do that, you can look at our previous video on how we install Active Directory, because that's pretty much what we did. We added the role first, which is the binaries that are needed for us to configure Active Directory Domain Services. So once you do that, you have the option to promote this computer now as a domain controller, or to come to the notification and you will see a place that says promote this server to a domain controller. So I will click on that, and this will bring up the domain controller wizard. And what we want to do here is we want to add a domain controller to an existing domain, because we already have DC01 in a domain, right? So we just adding an additional domain controller to an existing domain. So here we are asked to specify the name of the domain. So I will just put in our domain name, KLA.local. And then when I come to supply the credential to perform this operation, so I'm supposed to click on that, change. I need to first put in the name of the domain, KLA/, and I need to put in the username. So the administrator username is not administrator, it's Louise. So I'll do that, and then I'll put in the password. So this person, if it is not the main administrator, this person should be someone who has been dedicated that responsibility to be able to join computers to the domain. So if you are not able to do this in your organization, then probably you haven't been given the right to be able to join computer to the domain. So that's something we'll come to later on, how to assign rights, how to remove rights, and all of those things. So I'll put in my username and my password, but first I'll put in the domain so that it doesn't log into the local computer, but it log into the domain. So I'll click on OK. Give it a few seconds and let's see what happens. So after adding the domain and the user, so we just click on next, and then okay, so we are getting this error that it couldn't be contacted. Another thing I need to make sure that we look at is the network, because in our previous video we did move the server 2022, which is the DC01, and our Windows 11 client, we did move that onto a private switch. So I'll just make sure that the settings for this VM is on the private switch. So I'll come to the DN5 menu and I go to settings. And where I want to go is to network. So yeah, the network is on the private switch, which is private KLA. So this is good. And another thing we want to do here is to just make sure. So let us make sure that the network settings on this is set up properly, because if it's not set up, especially DNS, then everything will be so the network is set up. So what we want to do here is no 192.168.100. 100. So 192.168.100.99. Oh, sorry. Supposed to put ping, so I press it up arrow, repeated the command, put ping. So let's repeat that command again, see what happens. Sorry, I don't know what I'm thinking. Should be 2. Aha, so we made a mistake with the IP address. Like I said, once DNS is not properly set up, we wouldn't be able to join this computer. It's 192, not 191. 16800. Okay, so we click on OK, and then we close this by clicking on OK. Click on close. Now we come back to our promote the domain controller. Sorry. Yeah, so we'll come back here, and then now we just go to next. So we just need to make sure of, so let's go to, let's cancel this, yes, come back to it, promote. We want to add a domain controller to an existing domains. So come here and we just click on select. If everything is okay, it should even show you the domain. So for it in the password, I'll click on OK. Yeah, so it shows the domain. We can pick the domain, click OK. The name is here. And I'll go to next. And then since this is going to be our second domain controller, we also want to have it to be our additional DNS server to also provide redundancy for DNS. So we'll keep that option active. And then we also wanted to also have a copy of global catalog, because global catalog contains a partial information of all of the objects within the domain. So we want to have a copy of that on that as well. Yeah, for now we haven't configured any site yet, so every server we set up will go to our default site. We can always move servers around between sites when we come to Active Directory sites and services. So for now, I will just put in my directory services restore password, and I will go to next, and then I'll go to next. So replicate from, if we are at a location that is far away from our main office where our primary domain controller is, and we need to have the database of the primary domain controller replicated to this additional domain controller, sometimes it gets slow. So what you can do is to have it save the database of the Active Directory save on a media, and you can install from media. For our case, we don't have a media, so we will just say replicate from any domain controller we can click, but we only have one domain controller. Because imagine if you had 20 domain controller, you don't want to say replicate from any domain controller. You just want to choose the domain controller that is either on the same site as the additional domain controller or on a site that is very close to this domain controller. So we will choose this DC01, and then we'll go to next. And then these are the defaults. We just go to next. And a summary, we go to next. And then we let it to, yes, we'll let it to add a row. So every prerequisite check passed successfully. So to begin, click install. So click install to begin our installation. And we'll just maximize this. So I will pause the video, let this to install, and once it is done, I will come back and continue. So we'll give it a few seconds and allow the settings to apply. And once it is done, we'll come back and continue with the video. All right, so we have completed that process. So as you can see right at the bottom here, it has signed into KLA. So I'm just going to put in that user, which is our administrator account, and I'll put in the password and log into this computer. And now it will create the profile for that user, because this is the first time that user is logging into this computer. So we will just click on local server on the server manager dashboard. And when you look at the name, computer name is always DC02. Now we are no more having work group yet. We have domain. So KLA.local is our domain. So this computer has successfully joined this domain as an additional domain controller. So if I come to tools now, I will have my Active Directory users and computers. So I will just open that Active Directory users and computers. I will expand my domain, and I will come to users. And when I click on users to open my user, I will come down here and I will expand this. You see, we have this user, but this is the new domain controller we just set up. You see this administrator user that we renamed to Kou Louise. How is when come to member of, we see that it is the administrator. So it's a member of the administrator and these other groups, right? We'll come to groups later on. But the point I'm trying to show you is that the user that was created on DC01, it is now here in DC02. So again, this is DC02. Let's say we right click and say new, and let's say we say new user. So let's say we'll call this user Paul Riches. So I'll come to Paul Riches. That's the full name, and let's say the username is P. So let's say Paul. Let's say the username is Paul, right? So go to next, and we say user must change password at the next login. So as a system administrator, when you creating a user, you'll set up a temporary password, and then you have the user account to user must change password at next login, and then you go to next, and then you create that user. So we have Paul Riches, right? So we just created a user on DC02, as you can see at the top here, right? So DC02. So now let me come to DC01. I will just bring DC01 here. So as you can see right here is DC01. So we're on DC01. So let's go to tools on DC01. Go to Active Directory users and computers. And when we go to users, we should be able to see the user we just created. So here's that user, Paul Riches. So we see both domain controller are writable domain controller. Writable means we can, create and add users or group or add things to the domain controller, right? So when you add or when you create a user on one domain controller, that information is replicated to the other domain controller. So if DC01 for some reason, let's suppose that it is just the end of the year and we need to do servers maintenance of DC01. Let's say we need to shut it down, open it, clean the dust from in it, maybe upgrade the memory and do those kind of things. Once we shut down DC01 and we are performing maintenance tasks on it, DC02 will still be performing authentication and authorization. And then once we are done with servicing DC01, we will boot back DC01, and while DC01 handles the authentication and authorization, then we can shut down DC01 and we can be able to service it as well. Or in case one of those servers crashes due to some power failure or some hardware failure, the other domain controller will provide the services until we can repair that additional domain controller, or we can repair the primary domain controller, right? So that's how you can have a redundant kind of setup when it comes to the domain controller, so that when one goes down, another one takes over. But both of them can perform rewrite functionality. So you can create users, you can delete users, and all of those things. So with that being said, that brings us to our end of this video. So in our next video, we will go to our Windows 11 computer, and then we will start to remotely manage our domain controller. Because in the corporate environment, you will not always have a direct access to this domain controller. You wouldn't be spending your time within the data center, which is really cool, because you could make yourself sick, right? So instead of physically going to the domain controller and logging into the domain controller, what you would do, as an administrator, you will sit at your client computer, which will be your Windows 10 or Windows 11. Now with Windows 10, coming to end of life. So you will either be using Windows 10 or Windows 11 or any other operating system, whether it could be Mac or Linux on your computer. So let's suppose that you are on your Windows 11 computer and you now need to administer your domain controller. So you can connect to it through different means, but one of the ways you will be able to connect to it is to do what we call a remote desktop. So that will be the topic for the next video. But until then, take care. Thanks for your support. We really do appreciate it. Take care, and I will see you in the very next video. Bye.